Good evening, everyone. Okay, yeah. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Historic New Orleans Collection. My name is Amanda McFarland. I'm the Associate Director of Museum Programs. If this is your first time here, welcome. We are a museum, a research center, and a publisher here in the heart of the city in the French Quarter, and we collect and preserve the history of our city and the entire Gulf South region. So we're really excited to have all of y'all here tonight for this really important program. Let's see, if we have exhibits and programs throughout the year, please sign up for our e-newsletter to find out about what we're doing, upcoming exhibits that will be going on. Like us on Facebook if you want to keep up with things, and welcome again. We are so excited to be hosting this tonight. It's obviously a very important topic. We were approached a few months ago by Frank Perez with the LGBT Archive. And we were honored to be able to host this here and collaborate with them on putting this program together, and we're excited to have them here tonight. So I'm actually going to turn it over to him now to introduce everyone. The way the program will work tonight is we're going to have from 6 to 7 panel discussion with all of our speakers here tonight, and then afterwards from 7 to 7:30 we'll have a book signing with Robert Fieseler. You can purchase the book outside, as you saw, and the documentary by Roy Anderson, and they will be here to answer questions and to have your book signed. So thank you all so much.
Good evening, everyone. For those of you who may not be aware, the LGBT Archives Project of Louisiana is a nonprofit organization that works to preserve our local LGBTQ+ history, and I would invite you to visit us on Facebook and look at our website and learn more about us, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after the program tonight. So thank you for coming. Time is of the essence, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers, and I'm going to start all the way on your right. Clayton Delery is most recently the author of Out for Queer Blood, The Murder of Fernando Rios and the Failure of New Orleans Justice. The book concerns the 1958 murder of a gay man, which coincided with an effort by the mayor of New Orleans to rid the city of homosexuality. That didn't work, in case you didn't know. Clayton Delery is also the author of the Up Stairs Lounge Arson, which was named Book of the Year by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the very first time an LGBT-themed book has received that designation. He is currently working on a book about the history of conversion therapy. Sitting next to Clay is Robert Fieseler. I'm going to come back to him in a moment because he's going to come up and talk a little bit about his new book. So let me skip over you, Bobby, and introduce Clancy DuBos. Clancy DuBos is the political editor, columnist for Gambit Alt Weekly in New Orleans. He is also the on-air political commentator for WWL in New Orleans and a licensed attorney here in Louisiana. Clancy and his wife Margot bought Gambit in 1991 and made it one of America's most successful alt-weeklies. They sold Gambit in April of 2018 to George's Media, publisher of the New Orleans Advocate daily newspaper. Clancy began his journalism career as a general assignment reporter for the Times-Picayune while still in college in 1973. He eventually became the newspaper's City Hall reporter before leaving the paper in 1981 to begin working at various television stations and as an on-air political reporter and analyst, as well as Gambit's political columnist. He continues to write his political columns for Gambit and delivers his weekly Clancy's Commentary on WWL every Tuesday during the station's 6 p.m. newscast. As a journalist, Clancy has earned numerous awards for his columns and regularly appears as an expert on Louisiana politics on network radio and television talk shows. So we're glad he's here. And next we have Roy Anderson, who is a Cuban-American filmmaker, teacher, and historian from New Orleans. He specializes in Louisiana disasters that are usually not mentioned in Louisiana history textbooks. His 2013 documentary, The Up Stairs Lounge Fire, was the first film ever produced about this tragedy. 2 other documentaries on the fire were produced later, one of them from ABC News. Anderson produced 3 other award-winning documentaries: Pan Am Flight 759, the Continental Grain Elevator Explosion, and the Luling Ferry Disaster. His film on the ferry disaster served as his master's thesis project at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. The success of this film led to the creation of a monument for the victims in 2009. He has been an invited guest speaker at Princeton University, Tulane University, Loyola University, and the FBI New Orleans Division. Some of his TV appearances include the Lifetime Movie Network, the National Geographic Channel, WYES Informed Sources, WLAE's Louisiana, the state we're in. Anderson received a master's in communication from UL Lafayette, a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Loyola in New Orleans, and an associate degree in science from Delgado Community College. And that brings us back to Bobby Fieseler. Robert Fieseler is a recipient of the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship and the Linton Fellowship in Book Writing. He graduated co-valedictorian from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. His first book, Tinderbox, A History of the Upstairs Lounge Fire, published by W.W. Norton/Liveright, was published earlier this month, received a starred review from Kirkus, drew the attention of the New York Times, was called not to be missed nonfiction by the Los Angeles Times, and was named an Amazon Book of the Month. Robert's journalism has been featured in BuzzFeed and Quartz and been recognized in roundups of best nonfiction by The Atlantic. His essays have appeared in Columbia Journal, River Teeth, and elsewhere. A proud gay American, Robert married his longtime partner at Walden Pond and currently lives in Boston, Massachusetts. So at this point, Robert is just going to speak for a few moments about his recently published book, and that will set up our panel discussion.
Wow, what a great crowd, guys. Thank you. So a few words about the legacy of the fire in relation to recent developments, actually. So my name is Robert Fieseler. I'm the author of Tinderbox, which is a civil rights history about a notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place just a few blocks away from here, actually, on the seamy border of the French Quarter. Most of you know the story, as it's been in the news a lot lately. The fire took place at a gay bar named the Upstairs Lounge, called so because of its secluded second-story location, only accessible by a twisting stairway on an out-of-the-way street, and claimed 32 lives and injured 15 others on the night of June 24th, 1973. So all this happened 45 years ago last Sunday. No culprit was ever publicly named or charged for these murders. And then in 2016, suddenly, decades later, reports of that bygone New Orleans fire became resurrected in national consciousness, resurfaced in the New York Times and in the Times London, and went viral on Reddit, all in the wake of a horrific slaughter at a nightclub called Pulse in Orlando. This reclamation of the fire, though, in the context of the tragedy in Orlando, as American history in the 21st century, constituted a strange and unforeseeable pivot. No one had wanted to talk about the deadliest event to strike New Orleans in 1973, even 6 months after it happened. The average New Orleanian of that period, straight and gay, lived in an idiosyncratic Creole world where homosexuality could exist only so long as the behavior was not named or talked about, right? And it had worked for years, the average New Orleanian, in a strange way, I've found in my research, to make the trauma of this event and its painful legacy fade. Memories of Mayor Moon Landry remaining out of town for 2 weeks following the fire, the Roman Catholic Church refusing the cathedral to hold a public memorial, or 3 of the bodies were being burned so badly that they could never be identified and that were buried without markers in a potter's field. Few wanted to reckon with all of this directly. Worse, one identified victim, a World War II veteran embraced by the Upstairs Lounge crowd named Ferris LeBlanc, had been named who landed at Normandy, actually helped beat back the Nazi counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge, had been named a last-minute victim of the fire, and very sadly and unfortunately, Ferris was also buried with the unnamed in that potter's field. And yet, here's what's strange. As it's been in the headlines for days now, the LeBlanc family is currently trying to exhume their beloved Ferris from that neglected field in New Orleans East, where he lies, and bring him home for a hero's burial that he deserves. The Upstairs Lounge is again and again, we're finding, contemporary news. 3 days ago, the new mayor of New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell, we all watched her walk up the aisle of a French Quarter church observing the Upstairs Lounge anniversary, and it was the first time that had ever happened at an anniversary for the fire. And with her words in her presence, recognized the fire as part of city history, and then she marched at the front of a second line to the historic site of the blaze. How are all these dichotomies possible, right? An event so recognized now was swept under the rug way back when. How can an event without a legacy in one century gain a powerful heritage in the other? How could an intentional crime unsolved in its day be revealed in all its sordidness decades thereafter? And might a family denied the light of justice for decades perhaps eventually find something like relief? So when I first began researching this event, I heard about all this background, and I approached the bronze plaque at the historic fire site, and I was struck by a forward question that motivated my writing of this book. How is this here? Okay, the mere existence of the plaque before my eyes, knowing the context and the history, almost mockingly defied logic. How is this here? Who put it here? What had to happen for this to go here? It didn't make sense, given all the constituencies who tried to erase a burning building in the past, along with all of its screaming voices. Yet the endurance of the Upstairs Lounge fire in public memory, in the face of denial and apathy, is perhaps its greatest mystery. And I'm struck by a line that former MCC of New Orleans pastor Dexter Breck once told me of his often lonely 8-year struggle from 1995 to 2003 to raise the $5,000-some, right, and lay the plaque at the memorial to that event in the first place. And Dexter said this to me about the historic fire. It somehow refused to die almost. Let us never stop talking about what happened at the Upstairs Lounge, and let it guide this tragedy, be a cautionary tale, and let it also guide a more honest and productive dialogue for the true melting pot of culture and desire that is New Orleans. So I was going to read a small section. Is that okay, Frank? So all you need to know, this is the aftermath of the Upstairs Lounge fire. It's happened. Individuals only had minutes to escape. And the Upstairs Lounge, one of the most infamous victims, the MCC of New Orleans pastor Bill Larson, had burned to death in the Upstairs Lounge window, and his body was still lying there. So that's the scene. Down on the street, Upstairs Lounge survivor Ronnie Rosenthal guided Upstairs Lounge survivor Ricky Everett from spot to spot. Ricky was unable to see for the tears clouding his eyes. Quote, they had all that space for people lying there, recalled Ricky, and they were pulling the burning clothes off of them. By some strange fate, neither Ricky nor Ronnie turned the corner onto Charter Street to witness Ricky's best friend, Pastor Bill Larson, in his final repose. Upstairs Lounge survivor Courtney Craighead, however, did so and became dumbstruck. The legendary essayist Michel de Montaigne once described this traumatic condition as the body's inability to express that torpor that paralyzes us when events surpassing our capability overwhelm us. And indeed, Courtney Craighead struggled to inhale and exhale alongside Rusty Quinton and the other survivors of the fire, who by some miracle or some curse were forced to look up at the carnage also intended for them. Their guilt was sudden and uncontrollable. And Courtney moved like a stranger in his own limbs, dropping all of his social defenses which had protected him from the dangers of wayward openness about his sexuality. and he inadvertently used his real name when answering questions from bystanders and police. Just then, a throng of reporters and news crews seemed to materialize, among them John Laplace of the Times-Picayune and Bill Elders of the CBS affiliate WWL-TV. They showed press credentials, and police lifted the tape to allow them immediate access. En masse, reporters rushed survivors like Courtney. The cacophony of voices made it difficult for survivors to hear orders from police and firefighters. As the ranking officer on the scene, Major Henry M. Morris made a statement to the States Item about the Upstairs Lounge. Quote, "Some thieves hung out there, and you know this was a queer bar," he said. A second police officer, perhaps attempting to qualify Morris's comment, explained how it was, quote, "not uncommon for homosexuals to carry false identification." Ronnie LaBouffe, a photojournalist, captured images of the dead and despairing. Quote, "Fire came up fast," Courtney muttered to the States Item. Quote, "Two guys told me to jump and I was small enough," survivor Adolph Medina said to the Associated Press. Quote, "What was done intentionally." An anonymous man, interviewed with his back to the camera, told Elders, the WWL reporter. Seeing the macabre, ashen gray face of Bill Larson in the window, photographer Pat Bork of the Daily Record displaying a gallows humor, not uncommon to newsmen, took a picture and jested. At least it was only a mannequin factory. "Those aren't mannequins," someone else told him. A nearby tourist provided testimony to the Daily Record, quote, "We watched all those people burn before our very eyes and we couldn't do a thing to help them. Don't use my name. I just don't want to think about it. It won't help. It never happened. It never could have happened." Down the street, an Associated Press reporter watched a bartender set up a drink station on the sidewalk and do a brisk business with spectators.
Thank you, Bob. As I'm looking out over the assemblage here, it occurs to me that maybe a few of us were around 45 years ago and can remember what those times were like, but probably most of us don't. So why don't we start with Clay and then move down and talk a little bit about what the closet was like in 1973 and where the Upstairs Lounge fit into that environment.
These days, it's hard to tell how large a percentage of the LGBT population is out of the closet because the ones who aren't don't want to talk about it. But these days, probably more LGBT people are out than not. Certainly to their family members and their neighbors and their friends, maybe not at work where it's a little dicier. That was not the case in 1973, where most people were closeted at work, to their families, to their friends. If two men were sharing a house, the neighbors might occasionally make a wink, wink, nudge, nudge joke, but the fact that this was a couple would not be openly acknowledged. At the time of the fire, that had all kinds of ramifications in all kinds of ways. One of them was that any number of people who survived the fire found their names printed in the Times-Picayune or the States Item or the Daily Record as having survived a fire in a bar that was a known hangout for homosexuals. And so after the fire, they were horrified, not that they had been in the fire, not that it was probably arson and they narrowly escaped with their lives, but that they had been named as queer in public. The mayor did not want to acknowledge that the fire had taken place. When the Ralt Center took place, he was all over in front of every journalist he could find. Same thing with the Howard Johnson's incident, but here he remained silent, the governor remained silent, the bishop remained silent. And so a number of activists came from out of town to try and get this tragedy the attention it deserved. And they met with a lot of resistance from the queer population of New Orleans, who were horrified that these gays from out of town were coming to town and speaking to journalists and using the term homosexual. It's hard to imagine those things happening today, but the people who were afraid to speak out 45 years ago, and I would have been one of them, were aiding and abetting the public officials and the church leaders and the civic leaders who were doing their best not to talk about this.
Okay, Clancy, you are a very young reporter who covered the fire, and I know you've talked a little bit about what the media reaction was, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, 18 years old, wet behind the ears. As I guess the flip side of the closet for me was what I would call a cocoon. You know, I was naive. I'd started working at the Times-Picayune as a summer intern at the end of my freshman year at UNO. I think I started around May 15th or 17th, so I'd been there all of 6 weeks. It was a Sunday night, very slow night, and it's, you know, some of the memories that I have, for example, the night city editor came by, and I forget what time the fire started, but it was probably right around the time, 5 minutes before the alarm went off. And we were sitting around doing crosswords. Sunday was a slow night anyway in the summer. And I said, I'd been there all of 6 weeks. And he said, come on, somebody make something happen. And we all said, yeah, right, whatever. And within 5 minutes, the guy who monitors the police radio came barreling into the newsroom because he was a very large man. So he barreled wherever he went. And said, big fire in the French Quarter. And back then, and for several years thereafter, even today, actually, any fire in the French Quarter is a very big deal because the whole quarter is a tinderbox. So there's no such thing, when they hit alarms, there's a 1 alarm, a 2 alarm, a 3 alarm, et cetera, and a multi-alarm fire. 3 alarm is a big fire anywhere. Well, in the French Quarter, a fire probably starts as a 3 alarm, and that's just a stovetop thing, right? So this would have been, a 5 alarm fire was something that was almost unheard of anywhere in town. And this would have been, I'm sure, a 5 alarm fire. And sometimes they even use the term 6 alarm, which is sort of like that line in, it's 11, it's 1 louder, you know. So I forget the name of the film now, Harry Shearer's film. But anyway, but this was a multi-alarm fire. And I remember, I forget which photographer I rode down there with. I think it was a guy named Philip Ames. And we ran through red lights and came down, I think it was Camp Street, whatever the other side of Charters is. I think it's Camp Street. And we couldn't get across Canal, so we just parked somewhere on Charters and ran. And I remember seeing a couple of blocks up from the fire, drops of blood on the sidewalk. Now, it may have not have been somebody from the fire, but it looked to me, in my mind, that's what it was. And the first 2 things I saw when I got there were Reverend Larson burned into the bars. I remember I'm 18 years old. I just had probably my first girlfriend, my first sexual encounter just a couple of months before. It was not the first time I'd seen someone die. About a week or a week and a half after I started at the paper, I covered the drowning of a young man.
I'm sorry, can you speak closer to the mic?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which mic? This one? Okay. About a week and a half after I was at the paper, I covered the drowning of a 15-year-old kid up at Audubon Park who waded into the flamingo pond. This was before Audubon Park became the local and national treasure that it is today. And I remember being struck how this kid's only 3 years younger than I am, and they were fishing him out with a fish hook. And I tell you that to give you my mindset. I was just getting inured to death. Both my parents were alive. I hadn't lost even an aunt or an uncle at that point in my life. And I walk up and I see Reverend Larson in that photo, which still, if I close my eyes, I'm there, I can see it. And a man sitting on the curb, weeping, with his clothes almost burned off and skin burned, almost like hanging, weeping, saying, somebody please help me. And I wanted to help him, but I didn't know what to do. And the firemen were rushing around, and I think the history tells us that the fire was put out, or not put out, fire was put under control, which is not put out, by the way. I don't know the exact firemen's or firefighters or arson investigators' definition, but I know that when they pronounce a fire under control, that doesn't mean it's out. But it was under control, I think, in 17 minutes. It looked like it was still raging when we got there. but it was chaos. And I will tell you, Robert's book, in the brief time that I saw it today, I read the preface. This is a beautifully written book. It really is. He did a great job, Robert. It brought back many memories just reading the introduction, the preface. But for someone like me, and I think I may be the last surviving reporter to cover it. I hope I'm not, but and I recently had lunch with Ronnie LaBeouf, the photographer. He's only a year older than I am. I'm 63 now, so it's been a long journey. But this was far and away, even now, the biggest, most life-altering story that I've ever covered. And I was there 6 weeks after it happened. And from there, I forget who told me, but somebody said, go to Charity Hospital. And I can't remember, honestly, how I got there. 18 years old, I probably ran there. It would take me a day to walk there now. But and from there, I went to the Picayune and wrote what was called a sidebar story. And I appreciate that very generous introduction about me winning some awards. That story was actually the first award I ever won for a news story. It was from the Associated Press. But I don't think of that story as something that got me an award. I think of it as something that changed my life. And you mentioned Jean Laplace, who came out on the 25th anniversary. John came out to me about 3 years later. We were very, very close friends, but he did it in confidence. You know, I don't know how people who lived in the closet were able to do it. I was reading the introduction about the lies upon the lies, and because my gay friends are people I treasure just like my straight friends, and all of my friends I think of as the most honest people I know, and yet being forced to live this duality, which is not that unusual for New Orleans. When you think about a lot of this is a city that was the epicenter of the slave trade from 1810 to 1860. Because the slave trade at that point, after Congress passed an act that prohibited importation of slaves, they were breeding slaves to be sold domestically, and when a slave said was told you're going to New Orleans, it meant he or she was going to be separated from their family to be sold. And yet, 150 years later, we were an epicenter of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King founded the SCLC here in New Orleans. So this city has had a long history, and forgive me, I'm a history major, so I like to wax about this and I'll shut up, but this city has a long history of duality. I don't think that makes us any more comfortable. It's just something that we recognize is the reality here. It's part of the weirdness of our city. It both attracts and repulses. This is a city of contradictions, is a better way to put it. We have, throughout our history, we have been a city of contradictions, and I think, Robert, you've captured that beautifully. I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Clancy. Roy, I was wondering if you could speak to what the Upstairs Lounge was like. What kind of bar was it? What were the patrons like? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd like to digress about the closet really quick. At that time, in 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Okay, and you had a Tulane professor, Dr. Robert Heath. He was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Tulane. He was conducting gay conversion experiments on gays, sponsored by Tulane. So, why were they closeted at that time? And then there's Deliverance, the movie Deliverance that was out at that time, right? Which, Bob, you point that out in the book so eloquently, and it was a perfect point that you made there. But that bar, the Upstairs Lounge, was very unique, I would say. It served as a bar. It also served as a church. The MCC church was there. Above it, there was a flop house. There was a flop house upstairs, and also they had a theater there. So it was very unusual, not like the other bars, gay bars that were more upper class, like the Exile, you know, the Cafe Lafitte Exile, where Tennessee Williams was there a lot. So it was, I guess you would call it the bar across the tracks.
Sounds like it was almost, from what I've read about the upstairs, with the church being there, the theater, it was almost like a community center.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it felt like.
Which was unusual, given its location and the bars in that immediate vicinity. One of you want to speak to that, Bobby?
Sure. So Iberville was a street that had a kind of, to say it kindly, a seedy reputation that even perhaps persists into the present day. It was a place where some of the criminal underworld met and did business at certain bars, and some of the certain bar owners would encourage this kind of business. The primary suspect for the arson at the Upstairs Lounge, Roger Dale Nunez, was a hustler that would applied a little bit of his trade at two bars along Iberville Street, called one called Jean's Hideaway, one called Wanda's. On the night of the Upstairs Lounge fire, part of the reason why he ended up being violently, something that preceded him being violently ejected from the bar later in the night, screaming, "I'm going to burn you all out," what had to do with his occupation as a hustler. So he'd lost out on a significant trick. And this might not seem like a big deal, perhaps, or relatable to the average person, but when you're in the hustling, or you're in the essentially the gay for pay male prostitution business, losing out on a source of income when that might be your meal ticket essentially for a week or even that day is a very big deal. And so on Iberville were porno movie theaters. There were all sorts of different ways to access all the various vices that you might seek along the border of the French Quarter, or even in deeper sections of it. But the Upstairs Lounge was a bit different. As Royd and Clancy noted, it functioned more as a social club. It was more of an upscale establishment that had really strict rules that sort of prevented a lot of Iberville culture from creeping into the camaraderie and the fellowship and atmosphere of the bar. So the Upstairs Lounge, for example, prohibited hustling, right, which was a big deal for Iberville Street. They had to enforce that pretty hardcore. But hustlers could come to drink there on the off hours. And one hustler, who was nicknamed Napoleon because he dressed up like the French general as a calling card, actually met his lover, Stanley Plaisance, drinking at the Upstairs Lounge. The crowd wasn't sure what was going on. Napoleon's talking to Stanley. Is this it? Are they picking each other up? What's happening here? But to the surprise of everyone, love blossomed. And then Napoleon transitioned out of his role as a man of the evening. But again, I mean, the Upstairs Lounge was not, by no stretch of the imagination was it like a high-toned establishment, but it wasn't snobby. It wasn't snobby either to all the certain aspects of Iberville Street crowd. People were welcome so long as they came and behaved. It was a place where you went to have a good time and to engage in a kind of fellowship, meet others like yourself, and to also strike up conversations and make friends. People into modern bar culture oftentimes don't realize that bars used to be a place where you would go and strike up a conversation with an acquaintance. You wouldn't just go to meet someone that you'd arranged a date with on Tinder. Okay. But so it was the Upstairs Lounge served a lot of very valuable, very important purposes for the patrons, and it was very close to a lot of the individuals' hearts. There was a white baby grand piano in the first room that you would enter, and individuals would gather around there and sing songs. And their favorite song was the anthem. Well, Stephen Duplantis, who is an Upstairs Lounge patron, noted that they like to sing Oklahoma, so show tunes, but they also like to sing the song United We Stand by the Brotherhood of Man, which has very moving lyrics. United we stand, they would sing together, divided we fall, and if our back should ever be against the wall, we'll be together, together, you and I. And I think everyone thinks of that as a symbol of really what that bar stood for, which was men and women standing together in unity against the existential dangers of that era.
Thank you, Bobby. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings of this story of the Upstairs Lounge is that it was committed as a hate crime. And I don't think any of the researchers who've become intimately familiar with the story would say that it was a hate crime. The real hate crime was the city's reaction to the fire. And so what I would like for the panel to briefly discuss is the city's reaction, the police and fire department's investigations, and that sort of thing. Anybody, any one of you.
I mentioned part of this earlier. In the year leading up to the Upstairs Lounge fire, there were two major fire-related tragedies in New Orleans that people still talk about. One was the fire in the office building known as the Ralt Center. It was an 18-story building, I think, and a fire started on like the 15th floor and traveled upwards, and people who were on the top floors were trapped. 6 people died in that fire, which was 6 too many. And Mayor Landrieu, as I said, was standing in front of every journalist he could find, declaring a day of mourning for the city, making proclamations of sympathy for the families and the victims and their families. Archbishop Hannon did the same. Governor Edwin Edwards did the same. A few weeks later, a man named Mark Essex set a fire to the Howard Johnson's hotel and then started shooting people as they tried to escape. And ultimately, all kinds of police were called in to try and stop him, and it was a horrific incident, and a total of 10 people died, including Essex himself. And again, Mayor Landrieu declared a day of mourning, and he started several of the people who died were members of the police force, so he started a fund to provide relief for families of policemen killed in action. Governor Edwards, again, was front and center. Archbishop Hannon was front and center. At one point, he offered himself as an intermediary for hostages, you know, so that people were, but there were no hostages. It was a generous offer. I don't discount it in the least, but again, they were all putting themselves forward in extremely public ways. 5 months after the Howard Johnson's incident, the Upstairs Lounge fire occurred. And the death toll, 32, is double that of the Ralt Center and the Howard Johnson's fires combined. Mayor Landrieu was silent. Governor Edwards was silent. Archbishop Hannon was silent. There was an openly gay journalist in the town, in town at the time named Bill Rushton. He worked for an alternative weekly called the Vieux-Carré-Courier. He documented calling all 3 of these offices again and again and again to try and get someone to even come to the phone, and no one would do it. And their silence created a space where all kinds of people could come in and say other things. And probably the single most notorious remark was made by a local radio personality, and I'm 99% sure I know who he is. The remark is, turns up in all the histories. Someone has told me, yes, I heard this on the radio, but because it's not 100% certain, I'm not going to mention his name. But a local radio personality was making jokes on air about the fire, and he said, how do you bury 30 dead gay men? You bury them in fruit jars. And so he was, people like him were setting the tone for the public reaction.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the Upstairs Lounge fire, to address some of the media response, was international news, not just national news when it first happened. So Roy Reed, the famous Southern civil rights reporter, reported a front page story actually for the New York Times the next day, and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times all made the Upstairs Lounge their top story. The story actually reverberated and rippled for there and crossed oceans. So you find stories in the Irish Times of Dublin, and in Paris and London, even Australia I found a story. There was great interest in this kind of event. It was a dire emergency. 32 people dying in a fire was something that just drew eyes and really made a lot of headlines. And we're coming out, of course, in '73 of the Vietnam era, when the public's used to and adjusted to very violent, gruesome imagery in their news and in their stories, and they've sort of been adjusted, they've sort of been conditioned to not be shocked by these kind of things and to actually be drawn to these kind of events. They simply would sell papers. They would draw ratings for television. And that coverage, which was tremendous for the span of about a few hours of the first day, including television news coverage, dropped off almost immediately when it became clear what was the nature of the bar that had burned down and what was the nature of the individuals who had died in this fire. That's where I cannot find an additional story from the New York Times, and I cannot find an additional story from Australia or anything like that. Interest disappeared because individuals at this point in society, most readers, perceived homosexuality very negatively. Polling at the time, when people would even bother to poll this question, would say 7 out of 10 Americans defined homosexuality as always wrong. Okay? The average reader, when they would open up a newspaper, if they read a story that they perceived to be about a homosexual topic, they might be so shocked and offended that they would consider canceling their subscription. And then the word gay was utterly controversial then, because back in the 70s, even in 73, gay still meant Fred Flintstone having a gay old time, okay? It felt like that word about bliss and happiness had been pirated by these sex radicals, these sexual psychopaths that were trying to put a happy face on what was perceived to be as a very dirty kind of behavior. And no newspapers you can find who even continued to report about the Upstairs Lounge locally would use the word gay outside of condescending quotation marks. So it's interesting that that word hadn't even been accepted yet.
Anybody else on this topic?
Well, yeah, I wanted to add on to that. The politicians didn't say anything, but Archbishop Hannon did say something on July the 19th in the Clarion Herald. Although it's late, he did say something. He offered his prayers and condolences. So I just wanted to bring that to light.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, for weeks, especially the week after the Upstairs Lounge fire, gay liberation leaders, which were the early LGBT plus movement, heard about the Upstairs Lounge fire within hours, and they all descended upon New Orleans the next day. And they had spent the week following the fire begging for someone, calling the archdiocese, begging for someone within the Catholic Church, and in a city so Catholic, like Archbishop Hannon was called the Pope of New Orleans, begging for him to speak words of sympathy, especially in the lead up when they were trying to host a public memorial for the Upstairs Lounge dead. And I was fascinated when I read that statement from Archbishop Hannon, because it shows a man who quotes accurately the correct number of Upstairs Lounge dead, describes it as a fire that seems to be intentionally set, uses language that was commonly used either in the Times-Picayune or the States Item, and it seems to be a man who had been following the news closely. And yet when he did choose to speak up, he spoke up in a place where essentially no one saw it.
Clarion Herald.
Yeah, and it was an out-of-the-way column, right? It was he had a weekly column called Archbishop Speaks, and it was in
Catholic paper.
Yeah, it was in a story after the jump. So you'd have to
read that.
Yeah.
Well, in the Catholic community, the Clarion Herald was then very widely read, but that's only the Catholic community, and probably among what I would call the practicing Catholics. Probably half the Catholics in town didn't read it, but and I'm not defending what the delay in the Archbishop's response. I'm just pointing that out, that it was, I don't think it was sort of whispered in the dark of a forest. It was, he probably thought he was doing something, really making a statement in the context of the times, but looking at it now, it was weak.
Sure, it must have been very risky for him. I mean, at a time when it seemed like he had a powerful religious role.
Yes.
And in essence, speaking up in sympathy for the Upstairs Lounge dead could have risked upsetting many parishioners. And I think he was walking a very difficult line, which how do I address this terrible, terrible tragedy, this dire emergency, without also, in essence, going against church dogma and everything that my religion teaches about sexual aberration.
He certainly wasn't the only religious leader to be reticent, but there were a few that did speak out and did make overtures, particularly Father Bill Richardson of St. George's Episcopal Church and St. Mark's Methodist Church. So let's hear about those two services from anyone.
24 hours after the fire, Father Bill Richardson, the pastor at St. George's Episcopal, was acquainted with Reverend Bill Larson, the MCC acting pastor. And he had actually allowed, before the MCC started meeting at the Upstairs Lounge, It met for a few times at a chapel in the St. George's complex. And the parishioners found out about it and were very upset with Bill Richardson. In fact, one woman told him she refused to enter the chapel again until he had it exorcised. After the fire, 24 hours after the fire, he allowed a memorial service at St. George's in the same chapel. And he caught hell from Bishop Iverson Noland, who was the Episcopal bishop in town, and from his vestry board, who wanted him to resign. And he stuck to his guns, and in part because as he was dealing with all this and trying to decide whether or not he should resign, he went on a walk, and a couple of people who saw him on the sidewalk stopped him and said very quietly, "Thank you for what you did." You know, he got some very quiet support from parishioners or people who just knew who he was. When Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Church, came to New Orleans the day after the fire with a number of gay activists from other parts of the country, they immediately started looking for a church where they could have another memorial, because they felt like the St. George's one had been very hastily organized. The names of most of the dead weren't known, so it wasn't even clear who was being memorialized. They just thought that there needed to be another one that would be larger and more public, and they were turned down by almost every church in town. They were concentrating on the French Quarter. The Archbishop's office said that Catholic churches were for the use of Catholics only. No, thank you, you cannot have a memorial there. A Baptist church more or less laughed. Well, they were on the phone, so they couldn't have laughed in Troy Perry's face, but they laughed on the phone and suggested that he contact a black congregation, quote, because they're more tolerant of aliens there. The Unitarian Universalist Church offered its support, but it was a very small church in a very remote location, and they wanted to have a memorial in the French Quarter because the fire had been in the French Quarter, and they wanted one that would seat what they hoped would be a pretty good crowd. And so the Reverend Edward Kennedy, I'm Catholic, everybody's a priest. No, Reverend Edward Kennedy of St. Mark's Methodist and his vestry board came forward. And when Troy Perry said, look, you know, you're doing this, it's going to be at risk to you, one of the vestry board members said, we have a black minister and the 5 members of the vestry board are all white women. We've been called lots of names, we can handle this. And so a week after the fire, there was a memorial at St. Mark's, and well, I'll just leave it there.
Let me point out one thing, just as an observation. I mentioned earlier about New Orleans being a city of contradictions. This fire happened on the corner of Iberville and Charters. 6 blocks away on Charters is St. Louis Cathedral.
We are approaching 7. We've got a little time left. I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and I'd like to hear from each of you, and that is, I'm going to give you a minute to think about it, but what is the legacy of the Upstairs Lounge Arson 45 years later? Now, while you're thinking about that, you can formulate your answers in about a minute. Keep it to a minute. I want to recognize a couple of regulars from the Upstairs Lounge and survivors who were there that night who are in the audience. I know we have 2, although it seems though one may have gone to get some air. We do have Stuart Butler here. Stuart, would you wave at everybody? Sitting next to Stuart, who has just briefly stepped out of the room, is Stephen Duplantis. And I'm wondering, is there anyone else here who was a survivor or a regular at the Upstairs?
Well, I would just like to mention that it was Stephen Duplantis who warned Stewart that he had come up to the bar and said, hey, this guy was going by and said he was going to burn the place down. Stewart and his partner Alfred left.
In case you didn't hear that, Stewart and his partner Alfred were there. Stephen was coming down the stairs and said, hey, or going up the stairs as they were there, and said, you might want to get out of here. They threw out this guy and he's really pissed off, and he said he was going to come back and burn the place. And so Alfred and Stuart left and escaped. So thank you for being here, Stuart and Stephen, wherever you are. At this point, I'd like to hear from each member of the panel, real briefly, what is the legacy of the Upstairs Lounge?
In my mind, two very important things came out of it. One was, I've been dissing on Mayor Moon Landrieu all night, but a few weeks after the fire, he appointed openly gay and lesbian members to the city's Human Relations Committee. It's a standing committee that's designed to be a liaison between City Hall and the general population. Previously, it had only really dealt with black-white relations. So when he appointed LGBT people to it, it was a real shift in focus. And it started a dialogue between the queer population and City Hall that has never stopped. And I think that's the single most, in my mind, that's the single most important part of the legacy.
I think of the legacy thematically. So you have three tragedies with the Upstairs Lounge fire, in my mind. You have a group of men with an innate characteristic that they could not rid of themselves, and so they were forced to live invisibly. That's the first one. Then those already invisible men were murdered in an intentional fire. That's the second one. And then the third is, then all memory of those murdered men was wiped from the slate of history for decades. So in these three tragedies, which kind of stack on each other, you see it's really a dire warning about the consequences of closeted life in America, which is when you force otherwise law-abiding citizens to live in an underworld. In an emergency, all the ordinary protections of a society will not be available to them, right? The light of justice, the ordinary dignities of human death rights, family members speaking your names afterwards, all of that. And it reminds us that the institution of the closet, such as it existed as a conspiracy in our society to turn away from all things homosexual, it's an institution of great corruption and great violence.
I think for the rest of New Orleans, the Upstairs fire, kind of like, and this just occurred to me, kind of like what Katrina did when it ripped apart that mask that everything was okay here, and we saw a majority of our population not living very well and suffering tremendously. That mask of, oh, we all just get along, we all have Mardi Gras. No, it's really not all right. The Upstairs Lounge ripped open slowly, but ultimately it ripped off that mask. When I say ripped off, I don't mean stole it, ripped away that mask, that contradiction, that duality that, forced gay people to live underground and straight people to pretend it wasn't really there, whether you had a gay brother or a gay friend or whatever. It's going to be remembered, I think, as that pivotal event that said, you know what, we need to deal with this. We need to acknowledge this. We need to embrace it. And I guess it's what passes for progress that the Archbishop wrote a cod acknowledgement in the column 3.5 weeks later. It took the Catholic Church 500 years to recognize St. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. So I guess that's what passes for progress. But it certainly, it opened my eyes, and through that, it helped me to open my heart.
What I think of it, it's a wound that has not healed. It was unsolved. So you're bothered by that. It was not solved. The Pulse nightclub shooting, they have someone in custody right now. To this day, this is 45 years later. It's like a cold case, really. Well, they closed the case in '80, but you're still bothered by that. And this was the worst mass murder of gays in U.S. history, before the Pulse shooting. So that's what I think of. And that's why I remember as a child walking around there. My dad's here somewhere. He's a tour guide, but he would take me and my brothers to the building, and he would tell us the story. I said, my God, there's not even a plaque there or nothing, and no one was arrested. So you're left angry, really.
For me, it always occurs to me in June, especially during the Pride Parade when I cross Iberville marching and I look 2 blocks to the right. The victims of the Up Stairs Lounge could have never possibly imagined how far we've come in 45 years. And for me, it's just a reminder that we must stay vigilant because rights that we fought for and won can be lost. Today's decision is an example of that. That being said, we're going to end our panel discussion. I would like to thank our panelists. I would also like to thank you. And here is Stephen Duplantis walking down the aisle. Stephen, wave at everybody, please. Thank you for coming. Bobby's book will be available in the lobby for sale, as well as Royd's film, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure our panelists will be happy to greet you and chat with you briefly. So thank you and have a good evening.